32 Iraqi families lost 32 loved ones last Thursday in the Iraqi capital Baghdad after they woke up in the early morning to the impact of two deadly suicide bombings targeting a popular market in the city center. Tahran Square, where the twin terrorist attack took place, was seen to scores of dismembered bodies and hundreds of wounded victims. A day later, Daesh claimed responsibility for the attacks, saying they were aimed at Iraqi Shia Muslims. I wish someone would tell me how a psychotic Wahhabi Takfiri terrorist was able to tell the difference between a Sunni, a Shia, and a Christian Iraqi in the middle of the capital's open-air market. Hearing the story of how the terrorist attempted to gather as many victims around him as possible made my blood boil. The first suicide bomber blew himself up after pretending to be sick to gather people around him. The psycho fell to the ground and then detonated the vest after people rushed to help him. The second bomber detonated his explosive nearby just minutes later. The attack, which opened the door wide to many questions, came one day after the inauguration of Joe Biden as President of the United States. And immediately, hundreds of warmongering voices began calling for the US occupation forces to remain in Iraq, get this, to repel the attacks of Daesh. So Daesh, which had been eliminated at the hands of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces in most of the areas it occupied, except the areas under US control, only seemed to make a move when US occupation troops attempt to leave the country. And despite the fact that US occupation forces have been roaming freely in Iraq ever since they invaded the country in 2003, they sure seem unable to find Daesh to repel their attacks, which, by the way, have never once targeted the US bases. However, they can easily spot all Popular Mobilization Forces bases and bomb them unequivocally, even when they cross over to Syria to fight off the remnants of Daesh. Meanwhile, in the wake of the terrorist attack, Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi fired several senior national security officials of the country. These changes dominated the scene in Baghdad only a few hours before Daesh claimed responsibility of the attack, in a clear indication that al-Kadhimi is determined to restrict the security and military decisions to his own hands. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. A twin suicide bombing on a bustling commercial street in the heart of Baghdad on Thursday killed at least 32 people and wounded more than 100. In an attack that ruptured months of relative calm, Daesh claimed responsibility for the attack, which bears the hallmarks of the terrorist organization who has carried out numerous similar attacks in Iraq. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Laith Marouf, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Laith. And it was evident that on the first day of Biden in office, we just saw renewed terrorism in Iraq, specifically in the capital, Baghdad, in the form of a twin terrorist suicide bombing attack where two Takfiri terrorists detonated themselves in a busy market. What are the indications of such an attack at such a timing?
Well, it's a clear indication that the United States is returning to the strategy of using these Wahhabi Contras to control both Iraq and Syria. So what happened, this suicide bombing that happened in Baghdad was followed also by attacks on the Popular Mobilization units, Iraqi army units that in Salah ad-Din, and on the other side in Syria, attacks on the Syrian Arab army in Homs and Deir ez-Zor, all around the zones projecting from Al-Tanf occupied zone that straddles the border between Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, where the Americans are stationed, and across from Al-Shadadi in Hasaka, where the United States has these camps where they're holding ISIS fighters and their families. So we see a projection of ISIS attacks from those two zones into Syria desert and into Iraq, Salah ad-Din, as far as Baghdad also.
So basically, a day after Biden takes office, just things go back to what the Obama administration used to maybe make it as a routine in Iraq.
Yes, definitely. And Fortunately for the resistance and for the Arabic people in Iraq and Syria, this plan has already been defeated. There's nothing more that the United States can do through use of Wahhabi Contras as a tool of dominating the countries. Definitely there will be more deaths, unfortunate, very sad, but it will be useless and unsuccessful as it was in its heydays in the early 2010s, when...
Well, just a day later, we saw that Daesh took responsibility of the attack, and it is also appalling to me, by the way, that the world still speaks about Daesh as if they have a magic wand, that they can have the weapons that they want, they can get the funding that they need without looking to where this funding is coming from and where these weapons are coming from. The US has so far failed miserably in relying on these groups, but what else can they bring to the Iraqi political scene if the only thing that they can do is actually terrorize the public?
Well, obviously Saudi Arabia is the main funder. Behind them comes also Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Turkey of ISIS and other Wahhabi Contras. We know that, of the more than 4,000 suicide bombings that were committed by ISIS in Iraq, the vast majority of them are committed by Saudi citizens. So that means also Saudi Arabia is the major producer of these suicide bombers from the Wahhabi Contras.
And it's so easy for a Saudi citizen to just cross over and kill himself and kill others with him?
Yes, the border is huge. It's a desert, the Syrian desert that spreads from North Saudi occupied Arabia into Iraq and Syria, and it's defended, this zone. So we have easy coming in and out of the country. Plus, obviously, they can be smuggled through Kurdistan and through Turkey also. So, but the main issue that we have right now is that for the first time yesterday, there was an attack on Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, on the King's Palace, the Imama Palace in Riyadh, with drones. And it was declared by a local Arabian resistance movement, a new one that declared that they were responsible and that they will be responding to any attacks on the peoples of Syria and Iraq with attacks on the regime of the Saud family.
Well, it was rather something new that had happened, which means that Saudi Arabia is under attack, actually under retaliatory attacks, and could be held responsible for everything that goes on in Iraq. But the increased security alert in Iraq and Syria, as you just mentioned, along with the increased Israeli aerial bombardment on both Iraqi-Syrian border and inside Syria, are said to be indications of the US's upcoming plan maybe to increase the numbers of its troops, both in Iraq and in Syria as well. What's your take on that specifically in Iraq, and how do you think that this will affect the general political scene in Iraq?
It's very volatile right now in Iraq, the political scene. You have, the parliament had already passed last year after the assassination of General Soleimani and Commander al-Muhandis. They passed a resolution calling for the immediate withdrawal of all foreign troops on Iraqi soil. The United States has, until now, ignored that, but now they're also going to go against it by adding more troops, as we hear Biden increasing the troops in Syria and Iraq. And at the same time, just after the dual suicide bombing in Baghdad, there was, within 24 hours, 8 attacks on American logistical supply caravans that are bringing supplies to the American bases. So very soon right now, what will happen is that the American occupation soldiers will be almost held hostage within their bases. They will not be able to project their power outside the bases, and the only supply route for them will be an aerial supply route, which is a very dangerous technologically, and it's very dangerous to do that because the helicopters could be shot down by rockets. So the intensity of the confrontation is going to increase. The United States has to calculate, is it, how many body bags is it willing to accept?
Mm-hmm. Well, all of what we just discussed brings us to a main responsibility held by the incumbent Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who fired actually several senior national security officials of the country just before actually Daesh took responsibility of the attack. So it was hours after the suicide attacks, the twin suicide attacks. Now his move was a clear indication that al-Kadhimi is determined to restrict the security and military decisions to his own hands inside of Iraq. Is that wise of him to actually maybe hold on to the decision-making process all by himself? I mean, especially that he has been provoking the only force capable of actually eliminating Daesh in Iraq, and that's the Popular Mobilization Forces.
Well, we have to remember that al-Kadhimi was the head of the Iraqi mukhabarat, the Iraqi intelligence services, and he was kind of the main link between the American authorities and the Iraqi government prior to his appointment as prime minister. So, we have to understand what's happening right now is that he did fire most of the security apparatus leaders after the suicide bombings, claiming that their failures to stop those suicide bombings somebody needs to be held responsible for it, and therefore he fired all these people. It is a dangerous situation. As you said, there's now concentration of power within al-Kadhimi himself. And we have seen right now the PMU speak openly out against the presence of American troops and the attacks on them. So we have a dangerous situation where al-Kadhimi may reveal himself as more of an agent of the United States, but many people in Iraq will have to deal with that.
Well, that is surely to be seen in the upcoming weeks. I want to thank you very much, Laith Marouf, political commentator, for joining us from Beirut to talk about the latest developments in Iraq. Please stay tuned. We will next talk about Syria. As the U.S. continues to occupy parts of Syria in a clear violation of the territorial integrity of the Arab country, an Apache attack helicopter belonging to the U.S. military has reportedly crashed in Syria's northeastern province of Hasakeh, with no information available about the fate of those on board the helicopter. The initial deployment of U.S. occupation soldiers to that specific area was meant to plunder the country's crude oil resources. However, now it seems someone is making sure that the U.S. abandons their theft efforts. U.S. Apache down in Syria in this following report. A Boeing AH-64 Apache attack helicopter belonging to the U.S. military reportedly crashed on the morning of Tuesday, January 19, in Syria's northeastern province of Hasakeh, with no information available about the fate of those on board. The Arabic service of Russia Sputnik news agency, citing local sources, reported that the aircraft went down inside a U.S.-run base at the Al-Jabsa oil field in the oil-rich city of Al-Shaddadi, located about 60 kilometers south of the provincial capital city of Hasakeh. The sources claimed the helicopter crashed during a refueling operation and that there were reports of injuries among its crew members. The U.S. military has stationed forces and equipment in northeastern Syria, with the Pentagon claiming that the deployment is aimed at preventing the oil fields in the area from falling into the hands of Daesh terrorists. Damascus, however, says the deployment is meant to plunder the country's resources. The U.S. first confirmed its looting of Syrian oil during a Senate hearing exchange between South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in late July last year. On July 30, and during his testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Pompeo confirmed for the first time that an American oil company would begin work in northeastern Syria, which is controlled by Kurdish militants from the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. The Syrian government strongly condemned the agreement, saying that the deal was struck to plunder the country's natural resources, including oil and gas, under the sponsorship and support of the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump. Separately, the U.S. military reportedly transported dozens of Daesh terrorists from prisons run by allied Kurdish militants in northeastern Syria to Al-Tanf military base in southern Syria near the Jordanian border. That is the same Tanf area that Israel and the U.S. usually target to stop the advancement of the Syrian Arab Army, the only legitimate force that actually eliminated Daesh in more than 70% of Syria. Now, with us from Damascus is Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist, to talk to us about what is happening inside Syria, the occupied territories of Syria by the U.S. occupation. Thank you for being with us, Vanessa. Now, when a U.S. Apache helicopter is said to have crashed in Syria's northeastern province of Hasakeh near the Al Jabsa oil field, where U.S. occupation forces have been plundering Syrian crude oil, would that still make it an accident?
Well, as far as I know, we don't have any update on the reasons behind that crash, and I don't think there has been any official statement that I'm aware of, either from
there was no official statement.
Syrian military or from the Americans. So I think, I think we have to assume for now that it was an accident until we hear otherwise, particularly from the Syrian military. If it was brought down by Syrian military, they are normally pretty quick to put out a statement taking responsibility, but we don't have any such statement.
Well, but that also means that someone, some group of some form from Hasakeh might actually be beginning some sort of a resistance against the occupiers. Could that be an actual scenario in the upcoming weeks?
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible. We've seen quite a number of videos coming out of the region showing local and tribal members basically resisting the US illegal occupation of that area. And of course, a recent, I think it was a Reuters or an AP photograph showing a local child sort of digging through the rubbish surrounding the oil fields, trying to find food to eat, while in the background the Kurdish Contras, under the direction of the US coalition occupation forces, are, as you say, plundering Syria of its oil resources via the Delta Crescent Energy oil company, which was allowed to enter Syria under the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Well, the US occupation reportedly transported also dozens of Daesh terrorists from prisons run by their allied Kurdish Contras in northeastern Syria to Al-Tanf military base in southern Syria, which is near the Jordanian border. Now, that is in that same area, the US and Israel have been bombing any sort of advancement for the Syrian Arab Army or its allies. They are not allowing them to go and liberate the area. What is the US planning to do with those terrorists in that specific area?
Well, that's a very good question. Of course, not only is the US transporting ISIS fighters to Al-Tanf, but they are also transporting them across the border into Iraq, where they are being retrained and re-equipped into a kind of super ISIS, which is then being percolated back into northeastern Syria. And of course, recently we've seen a spate of attacks by ISIS against Syrian Arab Army convoys on the road to Deir ez-Zor, including one yesterday which left 3 Syrian Arab Army martyred and 10 wounded. Air cover was then given to the convoy, which allowed it to arrive safely at Deir ez-Zor. But in Al Tanf itself, of course, we shouldn't forget that there is a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around Al Tanf military base. The Al Walid crossing into Iraq is what is being used to transport the stolen oil into Iraq for trading. And of course, that trading revenue is sustaining the proxies on the ground inside Syria, previously ISIS and now, of course, the Kurdish Contras. But also what is important to understand is that in that 55-kilometer exclusion zone around Al Tanf, there are ongoing military exercises overseen by the US occupation troops using equipment such as HIMARS, the high mobility artillery units that have a maximum range of 300 kilometers. This puts them with potential to target the outskirts of Damascus.
Wow.
So terrorists are being given equipment which can effectively be used against, as you rightly stated, Syrian Arab army, Russian positions, allied positions, but can also be used to target civilian infrastructure in the future if there is an escalation, and we see very strong signs of an escalation under the Joe Biden administration.
Vanessa, what I want to talk about is that Syria has actually issued its first message to the new US President Joe Biden, urging the incoming US leader to withdraw troops from the war-torn nation and to abandon efforts to tap into the country's oil reserves. How do you think the new administration will receive that?
Well, I mean, I think it's very convenient that we've seen almost immediately surrounding Biden's inauguration. We saw an ISIS attack in Baghdad. We've seen, as I said, an increase in ISIS attacks on the ground in northeastern Syria and stretching towards northeastern Aleppo and towards Homs. And so, of course, if we remember back to 2018, December, when Trump said he was going to withdraw the troops, almost immediately there was an ISIS attack on Manbij, which killed 4 American operatives, potential intelligence operatives, and injured 3 others. And so, therefore, the plans to remove or withdraw troops were scotched. And now, of course, with the Biden incoming administration, and that administration consisting of, let's say, Bush, Obama, Clinton era war hawks and neoconservatives, we know that there is very likely to be an increase of American military footprint in Syria. And we've seen that in the last few days. We've seen military convoys, US military convoys entering northeast Syria with hardware and weapons, heading for the region around the oil fields, which of course is occupied by US coalition troops and proxies.
That raises a lot of flags, Vanessa, concerning that when you said when in the Trump administration, when Trump wanted to remove the soldiers, the people who are controlling ISIS, which, as you said, are within the current administration and the former Obama administration, were actually sending messages against their own soldiers by targeting them to make them remain as an occupation inside Syria. That's a very dangerous issue. But yet again, Biden has not set any clear strategy for Syria, but his campaign has sought to distance itself from the Trump approach. Yet Biden also never commented on the continuous Israeli aggression against the Syrian Arab army, specifically lately against civilians in Hama. Do you think that Israel can still maintain an open, aggressive policy against Syria now that Trump is no longer there?
Well, let's also not forget that the US itself, I think it was just prior to the inauguration of Joe Biden, targeted Iraqi army positions inside Iraq and PMU positions. So it's clear that what we're seeing since New Year's Eve, in reality, which I guess was kind of the handover period, the vacuum period between Trump leaving and Biden coming in, we've seen, as you said, an increase in Israeli attacks, leading to a couple of days ago an attack at 4 a.m. in the morning, which targeted multiple areas in Syria, including, as you rightly say, a little village, Kazoo, to the west of Hama, where 4 civilian homes were destroyed and a family of 4 was martyred and tens of others were injured. I'll actually be visiting that area in the next few days.
We are out of time. I want to thank Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist, for joining us from Damascus to talk about the latest developments in the occupied territories by the U.S. occupation in Syria. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.